We did everything we could, but sometimes even your best isn't enough to save everyone.
The rain tapped softly against the window pane, the kind of rhythmic patter that used to soothe me on long, sleepless nights. But tonight, it sounded different, colder, sharper, like the ticking of a clock, counting down the final moments of a life I no longer recognized. In my trembling hands, I held a fading photo, me and my son Lucas, smiling in front of the house I built with my own 2 hands. A house that, until recently, was filled with laughter, memories, and the quiet comfort of knowing I'd left something behind for him. I thought I was doing the right thing, transferring everything I owned into his name, my home, my savings, the land. It was all meant to be his one day. I just didn't expect one day to come so soon. He told me it would be easier this way, that it was time he started taking responsibility. I believed him. But within weeks, his tone changed. He stopped coming home for dinner. He replaced the family photos with modern art I'd never seen. Then one morning, without so much as a moment of hesitation, he handed me a letter. Eviction, from my own house. He said I was getting in the way, that I should enjoy the rest of my years somewhere more suitable. I stood there, stunned, as the world I'd carefully built around my son crumbled at my feet. But what Lucas didn't know, what he never expected, was that I still had something left in me. I may have given up my property, but I hadn't given up my fight. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. If he thought I was done, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. And what came next would shock everyone. My name is Harry. I'm 68 years old, recently retired, and for most of my life I was a carpenter by trade and a father by every measure of my heart. I've never been a man of extravagance, never cared much for luxury or recognition. What I valued was simple: family, honesty, and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. I spent over 4 decades building my life from the ground up, starting with a small plot of land I purchased with my first real paycheck. On that land, with bare hands and borrowed tools, I built a modest home. Not just walls and a roof, but a space that would become the backdrop for every moment that mattered. Every beam, every floorboard, every scratch in the wood told a story. I poured my youth into that house one nail at a time, and I did it for one reason: my family. When I was 27, I met the love of my life, Maria. She had a laugh that made you feel like everything in the world was okay, even when it wasn't. We were married within a year. A few years later, we had our son, Lucas. Everything changed the day he was born. I remember holding him for the first time, tiny and swaddled in blue, thinking, this is who I'm doing it all for. But life, as it often does, threw us into a storm we didn't see coming. When Lucas was 8, Maria passed away unexpectedly. One morning she was there, and the next I was a single father staring down the barrel of grief while trying to hold myself together for the little boy who looked too much like her. Those years after Maria's passing were the hardest of my life, but also the most formative. I had to be both father and mother. I learned to braid hair when Lucas's class had crazy hair day. I made peanut butter sandwiches when I could barely afford groceries. I taught him to ride a bike right there, in our gravel driveway. His knees bruised, his smile wide. I never dated again. My heart didn't have the room. I dedicated everything I had to Lucas. I worked overtime shifts, took under-the-table jobs, sold tools I loved, all to make sure he had clothes that fit and meals that didn't come from a can. We didn't have much, but what we had, we built, together, me and my boy. The house over the years became more than just shelter. It was sacred. It was where Lucas took his first steps, where Maria had once sung lullabies into the walls, where birthdays were celebrated with lopsided cakes, and Christmas lights hung just a little crooked. Every room was soaked in memory. I never imagined leaving it, not really. And I certainly never imagined being asked to. Even in retirement, I kept busy. I'd spend hours tending to the vegetable garden in the backyard. Maria had always loved fresh basil, and I kept planting it even after she was gone. I'd mend fences, patch leaks, and fix creaky floorboards that Lucas always said made the house feel alive. I found comfort in the routine. I liked waking up with the sun, making strong coffee, and sitting on the porch in the quiet, just me and the birds, and sometimes Lucas if he wasn't buried in work. We didn't talk as much as we used to, but I always figured he was just busy with life. Still, he lived with me, and that felt like enough. I believed deep down that this house would be his one day, that when I was gone he'd walk these halls and remember how deeply he was loved. I never questioned his intentions when he suggested we put the house in his name early. He said it would help with the paperwork later, that it would make things simpler in the long run. I agreed without hesitation. Maybe it was naive. Maybe it was just the kind of trust that only a father could offer his son. I signed the papers on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table I'd built myself. Lucas seemed grateful. I remember him patting my shoulder and saying, "You've done enough, Dad. Let me take it from here." At the time, those words felt like a passing of the torch. I didn't realize they were actually a signal, the first sign that something was about to change. Looking back, I can see the small shifts, the way he started locking his bedroom door, how he suddenly had a new group of friends I didn't recognize, the expensive things showing up around the house that we never talked about, but I ignored the signs. I told myself he was just finding his way. That's what parents do, right? We make excuses for our kids, even when they're grown, even when the excuses hurt us. Still, I clung to the belief that the values I had instilled in Lucas would never fade. That even if he took a different path, the foundation I built, of love, of hard work, of sacrifice, would always guide him. That he knew no matter what, this house was more than brick and wood. It was our legacy. Our home. I didn't know it yet, but everything I had worked for, all the years I had spent building a life for someone else, would soon be called into question. And not by strangers, not by time or circumstance, but by the very person I had done it all for. The boy I had raised with trembling hands and an unbreakable will. The boy I gave everything to, without ever asking for anything in return. It started with little things, barely noticeable at first. A forgotten thank you, a dismissive tone. Lucas, my son, the same boy I'd carried on my shoulders through fairgrounds and across stormy nights, was slowly becoming a stranger inside my own home. At first I chalked it up to stress, work maybe, a new relationship I didn't know about. Life was moving fast, and I told myself not to take it personally. After all, he was an adult now, with his own path to carve. I reminded myself that I had raised him to be independent, strong-willed, and ambitious. But over time it became harder and harder to ignore. The warmth in his eyes faded. Conversations shortened. He'd go days barely speaking to me, despite us living under the same roof. He spent more time on the phone behind closed doors, hosting friends I didn't recognize, drinking expensive whiskey in the living room that once held Maria's flower-patterned curtains and second-hand couches. Everything started to feel different, colder, less like home. Then came the day he suggested taking over the house. Not just managing things around it, he wanted legal control. He framed it as practical. Said it would be easier if the title was in his name, less hassle if anything ever happened to me. I laughed at first, joking that I wasn't going anywhere, anytime soon. But he pressed, reassured me, said he only wanted to help, that it was just paperwork, and I should relax and enjoy retirement. The words felt harmless, helpful even, and I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that he was stepping up, not stepping over me. So I agreed. I transferred the deed, signed the documents, and even added his name to my modest savings account. I told myself it was the right thing. After all, he was my only son. Who else would I leave everything to? But within weeks, the change was undeniable. He no longer asked, he instructed. He started redoing rooms without telling me, replacing furniture, repainting walls I had lovingly covered with photographs and memories. He removed Maria's favorite painting from above the fireplace, replacing it with a massive flat screen. I found her things boxed up in the garage one morning without explanation. When I asked about it, he shrugged. It's time to move on. Dad, the place was starting to feel like a museum. That word, museum, hit me like a brick. To him, this wasn't a living space soaked in love. It was old, outdated, a thing to be modernized, stripped of its history, stripped of me. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning. I remember it vividly. The sun hadn't even fully risen yet. I was standing in the kitchen boiling water for tea when Lucas walked in wearing a suit I'd never seen before. He looked sharp, confident, like someone who had outgrown his past. He placed an envelope on the kitchen counter and said without emotion, "We need to talk." I opened the letter, expecting maybe a bill or a reminder about the plumbing. Instead, it was an eviction notice. From my own house. My own son was formally asking me to vacate the property within 30 days. I looked up at him, my mouth unable to form words. Surely it was a mistake, a prank even. But his eyes were clear, cold, and resolute. "It's time, Dad," he said, flatly. "You deserve a place that's better suited for someone your age. This house, it's not working anymore. I have plans. You being here makes things complicated." I stared at him, stunned, barely able to comprehend what I was hearing. The floor beneath me felt like it had vanished. My son, the boy I raised, alone, who once clung to me in the night, who I fed and clothed with calloused hands, was asking me to leave the very home I built. I couldn't process it. All I could hear was the roaring silence between his words, the void where love used to live. "You're kicking me out?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't even flinch. "It's not like that. I just need space. You'll be fine. Maybe a retirement home or a small apartment. I can help you find something." The cruelty wasn't in his words. It was in how casual they were, how utterly devoid of emotion. I tried to reason with him, to remind him of our history, our memories, the sacrifices I made. But he shut me down with phrases like, "You're being dramatic," and "This is just part of life." I left the kitchen that morning not just as a father but as a man without a home. I sat on the edge of my bed, our bed, the one Maria and I had shared, and stared at the familiar cracks in the ceiling. They used to remind me of time passing, of life's imperfections. Now they just reminded me that everything I'd built could be taken from me with a signature. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and utterly disposable. Not by strangers, not by some bureaucratic system, but by the person I had devoted my entire life to. The days that followed were a blur. Lucas moved with increasing boldness, making plans for renovations, telling neighbors I'd be moving on soon. He didn't ask where I would go. He didn't offer comfort or company or even basic kindness. He was eager to be rid of me, eager to take full control of what I had once considered our shared legacy. And yet, even as the walls of my world collapsed around me, a strange sense of clarity began to form. I realized that the man standing in front of me, well-dressed, articulate, confident, was not the boy I had raised, at least not anymore. He had changed, and maybe, in some ways, I had allowed it. I had given everything without boundaries, loved without limits, sacrificed without expectation. And in doing so, I had taught him something dangerous, that love comes without cost and loyalty without consequence. But as I stood there, surrounded by boxes that weren't mine, in a house that no longer felt like home, something inside me began to shift. I wasn't just an old man with nowhere to go. I was still Harry. Still the man who built this house with his own hands. Still the father who had survived loss, loneliness, and hardship. If Lucas thought I would leave quietly, he didn't know me at all. I might have given him the keys, but the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days after Lucas handed me that letter felt like walking through a house that was haunted not by ghosts, but by memories, soft echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to the present. The air was different, colder somehow. The walls, once warm and familiar, felt like they were pressing in on me. I moved from room to room, touching the edges of my life. The scarred kitchen table where Maria used to knead dough on Sunday mornings, the faded recliner I had fallen asleep in countless nights after long shifts, and the framed school photo of Lucas from second grade, still hanging slightly crooked in the hallway. I hadn't packed yet. I couldn't. Every time I tried, my hands would hover over my belongings, my tools, old clothes, Maria's favorite teacup, and then fall to my sides. It wasn't just stuff. It was history. It was evidence of a life lived with intention and love. And now, it was being treated like clutter, something to be cleared away to make room for whatever Lucas had planned next. He avoided me now, no longer made eye contact when we passed in the hallway. If I tried to talk to him, he'd nod with forced politeness, say he was busy, and disappear behind a door. One night, I heard him laughing with friends in the living room, loud, carefree, like nothing had changed. I stood silently just outside the door, listening to their voices drift through the air like smoke. They talked about renovations, turning the study into a gaming room, maybe knocking down a wall to make space for a minibar. The study, Maria's study. She used to sit in that room for hours writing letters she never sent, just pouring her heart onto paper, especially after Lucas was born. I remember her reading poetry there on quiet afternoons, sunlight warming her face. And now it was going to be converted into a space for liquor and video games. I should have felt rage, but all I felt was emptiness. A slow, aching numbness that settled in my chest like cement. I started spending more time away from the house, walking through the neighborhood aimlessly. The streets looked the same cracked sidewalks, same peeling fences. But I felt like a ghost passing through a world I no longer belonged to. I would stop at the local diner where I used to take Lucas for pancakes when he was little. The waitress, Cheryl, had worked there for decades and still recognized me. She'd pour my coffee without asking and say, "You look tired, Harry." I'd smile and nod, swallowing the truth like bitter medicine. I hadn't told anyone what was happening. I couldn't bring myself to. There was a certain shame in it. Not just in being pushed out, but in having allowed it to happen. In having raised the very person who could treat me like this. People always say you reap what you sow. But what happens when you plant love and raise it with care, only to watch it bloom into something unrecognizable? One morning I came back from the diner and noticed that half the furniture in the living room was gone. Lucas was standing by the door texting someone, casually giving instructions to a couple of movers. They were strangers in my home, lifting the armchair Maria used to curl up in, the one I could never quite fix the wobble on. When I confronted him, he sighed heavily, like I was a child making a fuss. "It's just stuff, Dad," he said. "You don't even use most of this anymore. I'm trying to modernize the place. You said you were leaving anyway." I stared at him, the words catching in my throat. Leaving made it sound like a choice, like I was taking a vacation, not being exiled from the life I built. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he was tearing apart not just a home, but everything that held our family together. But I stayed silent. My voice, it seemed, had already been packed away. That night I slept in the shed out back. Not because I had to, but because I couldn't bear to stay inside. The air in the house had grown too heavy, saturated with bitterness and detachment. I lay on an old mattress wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar and sawdust, and stared up at the rafters. The shed had once been my sanctuary, a place where I built birdhouses, fixed broken chairs, and tinkered with projects that no one else cared about. It was the one space untouched by change. For a while I listened to the sound of crickets, tried to lose myself in their rhythm. But the silence between their chirps echoed with questions I didn't have answers to. How did we get here? How did the boy I once read bedtime stories to become a man who saw me as an obstacle? I started questioning everything, not just Lucas's choices, but my own. Had I failed him somehow? Was I too soft? Did I love him too much? Give too freely? Never teach him to value the things he received? I raised him with compassion, believing that kindness was strength. But now I wondered if I had simply taught him that people who love you will always tolerate being mistreated. that no matter what he did, I'd still be there, waiting patiently, arms open. That realization hit me, harder than anything else. Not the betrayal, not the eviction, but the thought that I had unknowingly played a role in my own erasure. The days continued to bleed into one another like watercolors left out in the rain, familiar shapes dissolving, colors running together until everything looked like a blur of what used to be. Each morning I woke up in that shed, stiff from the cold, wrapped in memories that refused to let go. I stopped going into the house unless I had to. The place felt foreign now, sterile and sharp, like a hotel room owned by someone who didn't know what it meant to call a place home. Lucas had replaced nearly everything. The floral curtains Maria had sewn by hand were gone, swapped for heavy blinds that sealed out the light. The old wooden table we'd eaten every meal on for 3 decades had been replaced with a sleek, metal monstrosity that didn't have a single scratch to tell a story. Even the walls were repainted, a cool industrial gray that made me feel like I was living inside someone else's life. But the worst part wasn't the decor. It was the way Lucas moved through the space, like he'd always owned it, like I was the guest. And when he did speak to me, it was in the tone of someone being polite to a neighbor they didn't particularly like. I didn't recognize his voice anymore. It was cold, detached, transactional. It wasn't that he hated me, no, that would have been easier. It was worse. He didn't see me at all. I had become invisible in the one place I thought I could never be forgotten. One afternoon, I heard him laughing on the phone, pacing the hallway, talking about opening up the equity in the house, using the old place as leverage for a business loan. He spoke like it was just property, like it wasn't soaked in decades of blood, sweat, and tears. That house had been paid for with overtime shifts, missed meals, and nights spent worrying if I could afford new shoes for Lucas when school started. It wasn't just equity, it was sacrifice, and he was trading it like it was chips at a poker table. That day I sat in the shed for hours, staring at a half-finished birdhouse I had started years ago. I picked up a hammer, then set it down. My hands, once steady and skilled, trembled slightly, not from age, but from restraint. I wanted to shout. I wanted to shake Lucas and ask him if he remembered the nights we slept on that living room floor, because we couldn't afford heating. Did he remember how I used to carry him to bed when he fell asleep on the couch? How I stayed up with him when he had nightmares? Did any of that mean anything to him now? But I stayed quiet. Because the truth was, part of me still wanted to believe he'd come around. That he was just confused, caught up in ambition, or surrounded by the wrong influences. That maybe, just maybe, the boy I raised, the one who used to draw me crayon pictures of our family, was still somewhere inside this man who now wore tailored suits and talked about financial freedom. But that hope grew dimmer every day. It wasn't just that he was pushing me out. It was that he no longer even pretended to care. I'd become a liability to him, an inconvenient reminder of where he came from. And as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I was starting to accept. A bitter truth: Lucas wasn't lost. He'd chosen this path, and he didn't want me on it. What made it worse was how carefully calculated it all seemed. He hadn't kicked me out in anger. It wasn't a burst of emotion. It was strategic, cold. He waited until I had transferred everything into his name, until I was legally powerless, emotionally exhausted, and financially cornered. And then he struck, not with cruelty, but with indifference. And somehow that hurt even more. The loneliness that settled in was unlike anything I'd ever felt, not even when Maria passed, because at least then, the grief was clean. It was sharp, yes, but it was pure. It came from love. This was something else. It was like dying, by degrees, slow, quiet, unnoticed. I began to feel like I didn't exist. I'd go days without anyone saying my name. No calls, no visits, no messages. I tried reaching out to old friends, but I didn't know how to start. What was I supposed to say? Hey, remember my son, the one I raised alone? Yeah, he kicked me out of my own house and now I sleep in the shed. The shame was suffocating. Not just because of what Lucas had done, but because I felt responsible. I raised him. I taught him to be strong, to stand on his own 2 feet. But did I forget to teach him compassion? Did I protect him so much that he never learned the value of struggle? Had I, in trying to give him everything, robbed him of the tools to understand what any of it was worth? And yet, even in the midst of that darkness, something inside me refused to fully collapse. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was survival instinct. Or maybe it was just the stubborn heartbeat of a man who had been broken before and found his way through. I began to reflect on everything I still had: memories, relationships, knowledge. Things Lucas hadn't taken, couldn't take. And slowly, without realizing it, a new idea began to form. Not revenge, not spite, but resolve. I didn't want to hurt Lucas, but I also wasn't going to let him erase me. I had let myself be silenced, belittled, displaced. But that wasn't the end of my story. It was just the point where the story changed direction. He thought I was finished, that he had all the power now. But he'd forgotten one very important thing. The same man who had built that house with his own 2 hands still knew how to build something from nothing. I don't know exactly when the shift happened. Maybe it was in the quiet hours before dawn, lying awake in the shed, listening to the wind rattle loose gutters on the roof I had installed myself 25 years ago. Or maybe it was while watching Lucas from a distance, laughing on the porch with friends like I was nothing more than a forgotten shadow. But something inside me stirred. Something old and quiet but unbroken, like a pilot light that had been burning all along. I had spent so many weeks in shame, believing that I was powerless, that the life I had built was slipping through my fingers and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But that wasn't true. It never had been. The truth was, I had been so used to giving love, giving time, giving everything I had to Lucas, that I had forgotten I was allowed to take a stand. I hadn't disappeared. I'd just gone quiet. And now it was time to speak. It began with a phone call, one I had been dreading for weeks. I reached out to an old friend named Daniel, a man I hadn't spoken to in years but who had once been like a brother to me back when we worked together in the early days of the construction company. Daniel was now retired like me, but still sharp as a tack, and more importantly, connected. I told him everything, not just about the house, but about the slow erosion of the bond between me and Lucas. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Daniel said, "Harry, you didn't just build a house, you built a legacy. Don't let someone erase that, not even your own blood." Those words hit me like a jolt. They shook off the dust that had settled on my confidence. I met with Daniel the next day. Over coffee and paperwork, we began to map out the terms of the property transfer. The fine print I had never bothered to read, the clauses buried beneath legal language I had blindly trusted. That's when we discovered it. A clause that Lucas had overlooked. The property transfer had included a condition, one inserted by the original lawyer to protect elderly clients. An automatic reversion clause triggered if the original homeowner became homeless as a result of the transfer. It was rare, obscure, and required action within a specific time frame. But it was there. And it meant that I wasn't just a victim in this story. I had legal grounds. I had leverage. But more than that, I had people. Over the next few days, word began to spread, not from my mouth, but from others who had quietly witnessed what was happening. The neighbors, the ones who had seen me tending the garden every morning for years, began to check in. Cheryl, from the diner, started slipping me meals I hadn't asked for, saying she accidentally made extra. Daniel introduced me to a lawyer named Mary Ann, a woman in her 40s with a fire in her eyes and a passion for elder protection cases. When I told her my story, she didn't flinch. "You're not the first," she said grimly. "But if I have anything to do with it, you'll be the last one who walks away without fighting back." And for the first time in months, I started to feel like myself again. Not a burden, not a victim. A man with a spine, a voice, a right to dignity. The case moved fast. The reversion clause meant that the house could be legally challenged if Lucas didn't provide for my basic living needs, which, given that I was sleeping in a shed while he hosted parties inside, wasn't hard to prove. But what mattered, more than the law, was the principle. Lucas had taken advantage of me not because he needed to, but because he thought I wouldn't fight back. And that was about to change. When the notice arrived at the house, a formal letter declaring my intent to reclaim legal interest in the property, Lucas didn't confront me directly. He left the paper on the kitchen counter like it was junk, mail, but I knew he'd read it. I knew he understood. And I also knew that this wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was a turning point in our relationship, one that would define us from this moment on. A week later, Lucas finally asked to meet. He didn't say where. I found him sitting on the back steps of the house, the same spot where he used to wait for me after school as a little boy. He didn't look angry. He looked tired, confused, maybe even ashamed, though he didn't say it outright. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Not in a defensive way, but like someone who was finally seeing the wreckage they'd caused. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in a long time, not as the man who'd betrayed me, but as the boy I had raised. "Because I let you believe that love came with no limits," I said. "Because I gave you everything I had, but forgot to teach you what it cost me to give it." He didn't reply, just stared at the ground. I didn't need him to apologize, not yet. What I needed was for him to see, to finally, truly see. I didn't back down. The legal process moved forward, and with the evidence and support I had, my claim was strong. Lucas didn't fight it. In the end, we came to an agreement. I would retain joint ownership of the home, with legal protections in place to prevent future displacement. He would move out. I didn't ask him where he would go. That was for him to figure out. Some might say I should have forgiven him completely. Others might say I should have thrown him out without a second thought. But I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to punish him. I was trying to reclaim myself, not just my home, but my place in this world. And in doing so, I found something I didn't expect to: peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally remembered who I was. And because even after being broken, I had the strength to rebuild, not just the house, but my sense of worth. Lucas had taken a lot from me, but he didn't take the best parts. He didn't take my resilience. He didn't take my history. And most importantly, he didn't take my name. The morning of the court hearing was quiet, but the silence carried weight, thick and expectant like the air before a storm. I sat on the same porch I had built 30 years ago, my hands resting on my knees, watching the sun creep over the edge of the roof tiles that I had hammered in myself. There was something poetic about it, really. Sitting in the bones of a house I had made from scratch, waiting to defend my right to exist in it. I hadn't planned to go this far. Not at first. A part of me had hoped Lucas would see what he'd done, that he'd come to his senses before it escalated into a courtroom. But the deeper I went into this fight, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a house. It was about reclaiming my place in a world that had tried to shrink me into silence. For too long, I had let my love for Lucas override my sense of justice. I had convinced myself that silence was a form of patience, that acceptance was a kind of strength. But now, as I prepared to walk into a room and defend my right to the very life I had built, I understood something clearly. Love without boundaries isn't strength, it's surrender, and I had surrendered enough. I didn't rush to respond. I let the silence hold space for the truth to settle. Eventually, I said, "You hurt me, Lucas, more than I can explain. But not because you took the house, because you forgot who you are and where you came from." He nodded slowly. "I know. I think I forgot who you were, too." We didn't hug. We didn't cry. There was no grand reconciliation. But something passed between us that evening. Not forgiveness, not fully, but the first quiet breath of something like it. He left shortly after, promising to call to keep in touch. I didn't expect much, but I didn't feel empty when the door closed behind him either. I felt still, peaceful. For the first time in a long while, I was home. Truly home. Not because of who was in it, or what had been taken or returned, but because I had fought for it. And in that fight, I hadn't just reclaimed a house. I had reclaimed myself. Life after the storm was quieter, not empty, but still like a lake finally calming after a long, relentless wind. The house stood just as it had before. Same walls, same creaky floors, same garden with its stubborn roses pushing through the dirt. But it felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because I had. I walked through each room with a kind of reverence, not just for what it held, but for what it had survived. The kitchen table, freshly sanded and polished, gleamed in the morning light. Maria's painting above the fireplace didn't just decorate the room anymore. It commanded it, like a memory refusing to fade. Her favorite mug sat beside the window, where I filled it each morning with strong black coffee, sipping it slowly as the sun crept up over the edge of the world. There was peace in the routine, in the return to normalcy, but it wasn't the same kind of normal as before. It was something earned, something reclaimed. I wasn't just an old man living in a house. I was a man who had remembered after nearly losing everything that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you have to protect, even when it hurts. Lucas hadn't called in a few weeks. I didn't expect him to. Not right away. Maybe not ever. That was something I had made peace with. Our last conversation hadn't wrapped everything up in a neat little bow, but life rarely does. It had opened a door, even if only a crack. And sometimes that's enough. I knew he was out there somewhere, probably struggling with his own guilt, maybe trying to figure out who he was outside of what he had done. And while a part of me ached with the weight of what we had lost, another part knew that his journey wasn't mine to control anymore. I had raised him the best way I knew how. I had given, sacrificed, guided, and hoped. And yes, I had made mistakes along the way. Mistakes of overprotection, of silence, of love without limits. But I had also taught him strength, resilience, and the value of standing for something. And maybe, just maybe, that lesson had finally begun to take root. Sometimes people have to lose what matters to them before they can truly understand what it was. I hoped in time Lucas would come to understand, not just what he took from me, but what he nearly lost in himself. As for me, I began to live again, not in the grand, adventurous way people often talk about in stories, but in small, quiet ways that felt more honest. I reopened my old workshop in the shed, fixing things for neighbors who stopped by, helping young kids build tree houses or fix their bikes. I planted new vegetables in the garden, tomatoes, green beans, and of course, Maria's basil. Every afternoon I'd sit on the porch with a cool drink, watching the plants stretch toward the sun like they too were finding their way back after a long winter. The community around me had rallied more than I ever imagined. People who had seen what I went through stopped by just to check in, to share stories, to bring me food or tools or just company. It reminded me that while one relationship may have faltered, I was not alone. I had roots deeper than I realized, roots built not just in blood, but in years of kindness, of presence, of showing up. And that meant something. That counted. The pain never fully left, and maybe it never will. Some wounds don't close perfectly. They leave behind ridges and scars, reminders that healing happened, but not without a cost. Still, I carry those scars with pride, because they tell a story, not of defeat, but of survival. Of a man who was underestimated, overlooked, and nearly erased, but who found his voice when it mattered most. Who remembered that just because someone says you no longer belong doesn't make it true. I often think about what would have happened if I hadn't stood up for myself, if I had quietly walked away from the home I built, letting Lucas rewrite the story without me in it. I think about how easy it would have been to believe that my time was over, that I had nothing left to fight for. But that's the dangerous lie we tell ourselves as we get older, that our worth is tied only to our usefulness, that once we stop providing, we stop mattering. It's not true. We matter because we are, because we lived, because we loved, because we carry with us stories, knowledge, wisdom that no one else has. And I realize now, more than ever, that standing up for myself wasn't just about me. It was about every person who has ever felt discarded, forgotten, or used. It was about proving that no matter how much the world tries to convince you that your chapter is over, you still have the pen in your hand. If Lucas ever comes back, and I hope one day he does, I'll be here. Not waiting, but open. Not angry, but firm. Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and love doesn't mean surrender. It means boundaries. It means truth. And most of all, it means holding space for someone to grow without letting them shrink you in the process. Until then, I will live in the home I built with pride. Not just the physical walls, but the emotional foundation I rebuilt when it all came crashing down. I will sit on this porch and greet each sunrise like an old friend. I will fix what's broken, tend what's growing, and keep the doors open to those who know how to knock with respect. In the end, it wasn't about the house, it was about dignity, about memory, about love with a backbone. And though I may be older, slower, and more weathered by time, I have never stood taller than I do now. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to share, but maybe someone out there needed to hear it. Maybe you've gone through something similar. Maybe you've felt the sting of betrayal from someone you raised, someone you trusted. Or maybe you're carrying the guilt of hurting someone who only ever wanted the best for you. Wherever you stand, I want you to know this. Your story matters, and you're not alone. We all stumble, we all fall, but it's in how we rise, how we reclaim our voice, that defines who we are. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own strength or helped you see someone else's pain a little clearer, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been let down by someone you loved? What would you have done in my shoes? Let's create a space where stories like this aren't hidden away in silence, but brought into the light where healing can begin. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you. It helps more people find it. And if you'd like to hear more powerful, true-to-life stories like this one, about resilience, redemption, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We're building a community here, one story at a time, and your voice is a part of it. Because in the end, stories don't just connect us, they remind us we're human, and that we still matter no matter what life throws our way.